Most men today can't sit with discomfort for 60 seconds. A slow email response and the anxiety spikes. A hard conversation gets avoided for weeks. One bad night's sleep and the whole day collapses. We call it stress. We call it being overwhelmed. We call it modern life. The samurai had a different word for it. They called it weakness. Now, before you switch off, this isn't about discipline porn or cold showers or waking up at 5 a.m. This is about something far more specific. A mental system. 4 parts. Refined across centuries of Eastern warrior history. And when you understand how it actually works, and I'm not talking about the watered-down version being sold to you right now for £200 a course, you will never think about mental strength the same way again. Here's where it starts. The year is 1612. Sasaki Kojiro, Japan's second greatest swordsman, is standing on a beach off the coast of Japan called Funajima. He has been there for hours. He arrived at dawn, as agreed. But his opponent has not shown up. The sun climbs, the heat builds, and the greatest swordsman Kojiro has ever faced is still nowhere to be seen. Then finally, a boat appears. Musashi steps off. He appears relaxed, almost casual. He's late, and he clearly doesn't care that he's late. In his hand is a sword he carved from a piece of driftwood on the way over. Kojiro's face changes. Something in him shifts, and every person watching can see it. He draws his blade, screams an insult across the sand, and charges. The duel lasts 3 seconds. Kojiro hits the ground, and Musashi walks away without looking back. He has faced 61 duels with 0 losses, not even one. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Musashi wasn't the fastest man in Japan. He probably wasn't even the most technically gifted. What he had was something else entirely, something he spent his entire life building, documenting, and refining into a system that is just as applicable to your life in 2026 as it was on that beach in 1612. He called it the way of strategy. We now have a name for the principles it's built on, and by the end of this, you'll know exactly how to use them. You may have come across something called the Lotus Method. It is a method with 4 pillars: awareness, flow, stillness, action. Branded, packaged, and brought to market in 2014 as a Western mindset framework. Sold in coaching programs, executive workshops, and self-help books. And let's just say, it works. Partially. But here's what the people selling it won't tell you. They didn't invent these ideas from nothing. They drew from principles that had existed for centuries, embedded across Eastern philosophy and refined in some of the most demanding environments imaginable. The 2014 version was built for productivity. The older principles were shaped in environments where failure carried real consequences. That difference matters more than anything a business coach in California is going to tell you about your morning routine. The Lotus Method, as it is presented today, is new. But the principles it draws from are not. They echo ideas found across multiple traditions, developed in different contexts, across centuries, and shaped by the same fundamental problem: how to keep the mind from breaking under pressure. That should tell you something. Because the Shaolin monks of 6th century China and the samurai of feudal Japan developed in entirely different cultural environments, separated by language, geography, and centuries of evolution, yet shaped by overlapping philosophical roots that moved across East Asia over time. And yet, operating under conditions of near impossible physical and psychological demand, both traditions arrived at strikingly similar principles for training the mind under pressure. The lotus flower becomes the clearest way to understand this, not because both traditions used it the same way, but because it captures a central idea across Eastern philosophy. The lotus grows in mud, not despite the mud. The darkness and the resistance are not obstacles to the bloom. They are the mechanism of it. The plant that grows in clean water produces nothing worth looking at. The one that fights through the mud opens above the waterline. And it is not just a metaphor. It is the underlying design philosophy behind practices that forged some of the most mentally resilient human beings ever documented. When you break these systems down, a pattern begins to emerge. 4 stages: root, stem, bloom, thrive. Each one builds on the last, and if you remove any one of them, the structure weakens. Musashi is the anchor here, but he was not alone. Understanding where each piece actually came from and what it cost the people who built it is the only way to understand why it works. The first pillar is awareness. The Shaolin monks did not call it mindfulness. They called it yi, intent, not passive awareness, but directed attention, the ability to place your focus exactly where you want it and keep it there, even when everything in your body is trying to pull it away. And they did not train this in quiet rooms. They trained it physically, through a practice known as the horse stance. This hold requires your thighs to be parallel to the ground, with feet shoulder-width apart. No movement is permitted. You hold the position and you don't break it. Within minutes, the legs begin to shake. Within 20 minutes, the pain becomes serious. Within an hour, the body is screaming. And that's when something interesting happens. A voice appears. In broader Buddhist teaching, this restless, reactive mind is often described as the monkey mind, loud, impulsive, constantly trying to pull you away from what matters. The horse stance, therefore, became a trigger. The environment was designed to bring that voice to the surface. Because you don't discover your mind when things are easy. You discover it when something inside you is trying to make you stop. Their practice, influenced by Buddhist principles like sati or bare attention, was not to silence that voice. Silencing it is impossible. The practice was to watch it, to observe the desire to quit as a separate thing. A voice in the room, not the inhabitant of the room. You notice it. You do not obey it. And that distinction is everything. Harvard psychologists studying metacognition, the ability to observe your own mental states in real time, rather than being consumed by them, identify it as one of the strongest predictors of resilience and sustained performance under stress ever measured. The monks didn't have the research, they had the result. And there they built it through sustained discomfort, because awareness only becomes real when something is genuinely trying to break you. A 10-minute guided meditation is not awareness training. It is awareness introduction. The monks knew the difference. But awareness alone doesn't win duels. The second pillar is where Musashi's genius becomes undeniable, and it's built on a principle that directly contradicts everything modern self-improvement tells you about effort. Musashi completed the Book of 5 Rings in a cave, alone, in 1645, days before his death. He was 61 years old. He had been refining the ideas inside it for 4 decades of combat, observation, and practice. And the core of his philosophy of movement is this: the greatest error a warrior makes is forcing action through internal resistance. He described the ideal state as mizu, no kokoro, mind like water, not calm, not passive, because water is neither of those things. Water is perfectly responsive. It moves without friction. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. It exerts no unnecessary force and wastes no energy on resistance. This mirrors Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of effortless action, although Musashi himself arrived at it through his own path of combat and observation. It is not the absence of effort, but the absence of internal friction. When Musashi arrived late to the beach at Ganryujima, he was not being arrogant. He was embodying that same principle, removing friction before the moment even began. Kojiro had been negotiating with his own mind for 3 hours in the heat. Musashi stepped off the boat, and he was already done negotiating. The third pillar is the one the modern Lotus Method got most wrong. They called it stillness, and described it as a morning habit. The original, what the samurai called Mushin, is something far more radical than sitting quietly before breakfast. Mushin translates to no mind. The literal translation is that simple and that strange. Zen master Takuan Soho, who corresponded directly with the samurai class throughout the 17th century, wrote a letter to the swordsman, Yagyu Munenori, that has survived to this day. It is called the unfettered mind. In it, he wrote that the moment a warrior's mind stops on an opponent's sword, on his own breathing, on a flicker of self-doubt, he is already finished. In the time it takes that thought to complete itself, the blade has already moved. Mushin was the trained elimination of emotional noise. Fear, ego, the desire to win, the tension of losing, all of it was reduced not through suppression, but through systematic exposure under pressure. The samurai didn't build this state in silence. They built it in environments where the stakes were real, the pressure was immediate, and hesitation carried consequences. Samadhi, the corresponding state in broader Eastern philosophy, describes something similar. Complete absorption, zero internal interference, a consciousness that processes reality without distortion. Modern neuroscience has observed similar patterns in peak performance states. Research using brain imaging on expert performers, surgeons, athletes, and musicians consistently shows reduced activity in areas responsible for self-monitoring during optimal performance. Mushin, from a modern perspective, closely resembles this state, where action occurs without interference from doubt, hesitation, or overanalysis. Which brings us to the fourth pillar, and this is the one that separates what the samurai built from every modern habit system in existence. It does not ask you to feel motivated. It assumes, correctly, that you will not. The Bushido Code, the ethical and behavioral framework of the samurai class, contained a concept with no precise English translation. Giri. It is most often rendered as duty, but that undersells it. Giri was not an obligation you chose. It was a structural reality. Within the samurai's world, certain actions were simply what a man of his standing did. The question of whether he felt like it was not a question that existed. Musashi trained his sword technique every single day for decades. Within his value system, not training was not an option his identity permitted. The decision had already been made, not that morning, but years earlier. Here is the honest difference between what was sold in 2014 and what the samurai actually built. The modern Lotus Method asks you to practice these 4 pillars in conditions designed to be comfortable. Quiet rooms, guided audio, scheduled sessions with no real stakes. And that is precisely why it delivers partial results. You cannot build a mind that holds under pressure by only ever practicing in the absence of pressure. The samurai did not have a morning routine. They had a standard. The standard did not move based on how they felt. That is the secret. That is the whole thing. An unbreakable mind is not built through insight. It is built through repeated contact with the thing that wants to break it. With a structure underneath you that makes quitting harder than continuing. So here is what that actually looks like today. Watch the voice that tells you to stop, but do not obey it. Schedule your most important actions so the decision is never up for debate each morning. Do the thing that matters in conditions that are slightly harder than you would prefer, not slightly easier. Tie your commitments to your identity, not your motivation, because motivation leaves and identity stays. That is it. 4 pillars. 1,000 years old. It still works for the same reason it always did, because the biology has not changed. The mind still responds to resistance exactly the way it did in a Shaolin monastery in 600 AD and on a beach in Japan in 1612. The lotus does not bloom despite the mud. It blooms because of it. And now you know how to use the mud.